Welcome to this edition of Ed Insights, where innovators and thought leaders come together to consider what's possible as we look to the future. I'm your host, Chuck Ambrose, and I'm really grateful to bring you this future-facing conversation where the future of college starts today. And with our guest on this episode, it would be fair to say probably that the future of intercollegiate athletics may change by the time we're finished with this conversation because it's that dynamic of an environment. Ed Insights is available on all major streaming platforms. You can also watch on YouTube. Please be sure to subscribe, share, and more importantly, engage. Let us know the topics you'd like to consider and the people you'd like to hear from. And I really, when I think about not only the meaning of intercollegiate athletics, but more importantly, the future, I am really excited to welcome Amy Perko, the CEO of the Knight Commission, today's conversation. Amy, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's good to be with you, Chuck.
Well, and a little confessional, our paths have run aside each other for quite some time. Some deep family roots that we share. And Amy brings to us today a lens that has really been shaped by being a former student athlete, the parent of a student athlete, which I think offers a whole different perspective, a member of the national office staff at the NCAA, a campus-based leader at the University of Kansas. And Amy, as I was thinking about it, I was becoming chair of Division II and on the executive committee of the NCAA about the time that you assumed responsibility at the Knight Commission. And, just wonder out loud, did we ever think, right, that college sports would evolve to what it's becoming? And really, wondered if you would put your journey, right, and what college athletics means to you into how that shapes your work and your vision for what's coming.
Yeah, no, great. And thanks for that nice introduction, Chuck. And I was really fortunate to have a great experience academically, athletically at Wake Forest University, and it did shape a lot of what I believe is very important about college sports. And the work of the Knight Commission, in a nutshell, has been to emphasize the college and college sports, right? To allow young women and men those opportunities to develop and develop their human potential. And that's growth athletically, but growth academically and socially, and all those important areas of being well-rounded and what college provides to so many young people. And so being able to have the opportunity to compete in your sport and where you have your passion, and to try to reach your potential during those college years in that kind of environment. And then also to find your way in terms of what your passion is, of what your career can be in areas other than sport. And so, the focus of the Knight Commission, when I first became involved, it was really a focus on the academic mission and the educational, really the educational mission, and whether athletes were graduating and at the rates that they should, and really putting an emphasis on what should the policies be to help really emphasize the academic mission. And I really thought it was going to be, a 2 to 3 year consulting job because of what we were pushing for. And it was, the early years of the Knight Commission did have an impact on the academic reforms that went into place, the progress toward degree for eligibility purposes, athletes having to be, on track to graduate, to continue year to year to be eligible. And then a couple of major reforms that we pushed. One was requiring teams to be on track to graduate at least half their athletes to be eligible for postseason competition. And it took that was a real push, and it took more years to get that passed than we thought it would. But it did go into effect around 2011. And then we ultimately were also able to get the NCAA to change its, annual multi-million dollar revenue distribution system to embed academic incentives so that schools were not just rewarded for how their men's basketball teams did in the tournament, but that they were also rewarded for how the teams achieved their graduation rates. And those academic reforms really were central and influential to helping Division I athletes record what they have recorded the past several years, just record high graduation rates. So the reforms obviously did have the positive impact and the impact that was intended to really put that emphasis on the academic mission.
Yeah, and that really does outline some of the real major accomplishments of the Knight Commission that many of us believe would never have been possible without that leadership nudge, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that facilitative power. Um, I learned this, Amy, being involved in a commission meeting at one time. But why does the Knight Foundation sustain? It's been a longstanding commitment to this intercollegiate athletic enterprise. Just a little history,
Yeah,
how they got involved and
sure,
why
sure.
they stay involved.
Yeah, and we're an independent group. We're funded by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. The really short history of how the Knight Foundation got involved was, in the late 80s, is when graduation rates for football and basketball in particular at Division I were very, very low. And two giants in higher education at the time, Bill Friday, who, was a former president of the North Carolina system and really built the North Carolina system. And then the president of Notre Dame, Ted Hesper. And what I often describe for those who don't know them, if there were a Mount Rushmore of higher education leaders, those
They would
those
be on
two
it.
gentlemen would be on it. But they went to Knight Found. They were really troubled about graduation rates and some related scandals in college sports, and they went to um, the then president of Knight Foundation, Creed Black, and said, "We really want to have a presidential-led kind of blue ribbon commission, independent, to help chart a reform course for college sports." And at that time, the NCAA governance was very different, and athletic directors were really in charge of the NCAA. And so that's how it started. And again, that initial focus was on the academic reforms, but in pushing out uh, the kind of roadmap, if you will, that then was followed to help improve graduation rates. It was about stating very clearly what should the principles be in college sports and what should guide. What are those principles and guiding principles? And frankly, if you look at for years everyone complained about how how many pages the NCAA manual is. But if you look at the first 2 pages, it's a statement of principles. And so our focus really has been, what are the principles and how do you put those principles into practice? And it's, in some ways it is that simple. So even here more recently around the principle of gender equity, the NCAA has a principle of gender equity. And so we ask the question, how is that put into practice in ways other than what, campus leaders are doing for gender equity? But at the national level, we encourage the NCAA to change again its revenue distribution. And we said, if as a national organization you're operating in a gender equitable manner, you can't just give hundreds of millions of dollars to institutions and conferences based on the performance of men's basketball teams only. Like, if you're, as a national organization, if you're going to reward athletic performance and success, then you have to do that on a gender equitable basis. And so that led to, the NCAA for the first time this past March Madness, beginning to reward for the success of women's basketball teams. We didn't specify, which. It's just, again, putting the principle into practice. So kind of tying that all back into the history, but that has been kind of the legacy of Bill Friday and Ted Hesburgh to state what the principles should be. And then, we really haven't changed those. The principles don't change. So it's just about how you're putting those into practice.
And if you think about the reach of intercollegiate athletics, both across all divisions, but also the NAIA, when you had an economic model that 94 cents of every dollar supported Division One, there was a reliance, right, by two and three on that model. And of course, now this economy and kind of the model shifting even more so, which we can think about the future. One other question, Amy, you mentioned Bill Friday and Ted Hesburgh, and I guess I probably recommend the Hesburgh papers to anybody who, is in higher ed still, right,
Mm-hmm.
for relevance. Champions like Britt Kerwin, your board has been made up of champions for the last 20 years. When you
Right.
mention academic reform, I have to mention Walt Harrison, right?
Right.
Because,
Mm-hmm.
but of those mentors, right, the voices, like who are you listening to now? What compass, right, as CEO of the Knight Commission, how do they shape the agenda, the priorities as we face kind of current state intercollegiate athletics?
Right. Now, that's a great question. And I have been so fortunate to, you know, have the opportunity to work with and be mentored by and to learn from, folks like leaders like Britt Kerwin and Bill Friday and Carol Cartwright, Walt Harrison, go down the line. There's so many. And now Lynn Elmore and Pam Bernard are our co-chairs. And one of the things that we've been very intentional about with the Knight Commission is if you look at our membership, it's basically 22 members, and they're from all different, experiences, the diversity of experience in their professional careers, and the diversity of thought as well. But the power of bringing, that group together around shared values and principles, um, has been really, beneficial to have, you know, as well at the table, individuals who've competed in college within the past 5 years, so a breadth of kind of an age range as well, and different perspectives at the table. But it's emphasized to us, one of the things we continue to push for, and we think the NCAA governance would be better for it, is the value of having independent directors on the board. Of course, we were successful in 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 getting that change to the NCAA Board of Governors that does have a couple of independent directors, but we think at the policy level as well, it would still benefit the NCAA to do that.
And as you mentioned, governance, because I think Britt Kerwin's real emphasis back was governance, right, of,
Mm-hmm.
of who really helps to make the decisions.
Right.
It makes me think back, Amy, and I've mentioned it to you this over time. Um, it perhaps was a bit historical. Dr. Brand used to host Wednesday night dinners before governance meetings with chairs of the division, sitting at dinner with Michael Adams, who was chairing the executive committee, and Jim
Mm-hmm.
Barker, who was chair of Division One. I have to confess, John Fry and I were passive observers, right,
Mm-hmm.
because of two and three.
Mm-hmm.
But the real question was, because of issues like at the time, Native American imagery, mascot,
Mm-hmm.
alcohol imagery, right, that was being projected through football. Should the NCAA take back basic control of college football?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that would have been quite a struggle, and we know it didn't happen. But have to ask, right, Amy, given where we
Mm-hmm.
are today, what if, right? How would have that shaped a reality up against now where college football drives three or four more commas to what basketball revenue really
Right.
does, right? So
Right.
would it would have been managed different? Could you, back when we were thinking about, core issues like academic reform and financial transparency,
Right,
um, that was a critical question, and
right.
we know what the answer is. But what's your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's my thoughts more about kind of the present and not so much of how would it look different than it does today, but just pointing out that, and the commission's been very clear in saying this. I mean, the commission recommended 5 years ago in 2020 that there be a separate entity established to govern big revenue football, separate from the NCAA, and that it be funded by the college football playoff. We've made some headway in educating a lot of people on this point, but several years ago, there's a lot more misunderstanding than there is today that the college football playoff is a separate LLC. It's a separate entity, and there's still a great bit of misunderstanding, particularly from the public and lawmakers as well, that the NCAA does not get any money from the CFP. The NCAA does not receive any revenues whatsoever from big revenue football, but yet the NCAA absorbs the liabilities for the operation of that sport. And that issue has been something the commission has continued to spotlight because it's a dysfunctional system, and there are a lot of everything from how some of the incentives are shaped, and now there's the incentives are just overweighted towards that sport, and some folks may say, well, that's the sport that brings in money, but again, this entire industry, college sports, is operating under a not-for-profit educational association. And so that, as long as it continues to operate under a not-for-profit educational association, then the incentives need to be aligned with the principles, right? And and so there's a lot of inconsistencies, and at least from our view, a lot of dysfunction that still is because of the way, the biggest engine driving the sport is operated outside the system, and really with, four major conferences in competition with each other, and not coordinated in a way that ultimately is for the collective good. And so that's, this moment where we have Congress considering federal legislation that could remake Division I in particular, Division I college sports, and set a new framework for it. It's really important to correct some of these misalignments of the past at this moment when it could be remade legislatively.
There's been a continual concession that much of this can't be fixed without congressional intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Although some may say that relying on any federal entity right now, especially, would be difficult.
Right.
But why don't we talk about that just for a minute? Because most recently, you were able to have conversations with Senator Cantwell and the commission, and kind of underlining the differences between the SCORE Act and the SAFE Act, and there's some elements that are really built in to, we're approaching $3 billion of revenue, right, from football, that must be kind of either distributed or redistributed or shared, and lots of other factors. But as not only her testimony, but you've also done a lot of work recently on what leaders perceive in how we're headed, as well as the
Mm-hmm.
public. So maybe
Sure.
all three of those pieces kind of come together.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a shot at that, and just from a historical perspective too, it's interesting because one of the reasons the Knight Commission was founded, when it was university presidents wanted to keep Congress out of college sports and show, hey, we can take care of our own responsibilities here, and we can create the reforms that are needed. But we are at a different moment, right? With the litigation has never been what it is now, and so there are some fundamental components that is going to be challenging for universities and the NCAA in particular to operate without some clarity around some of the rules. But let me, on terms of the survey, the Knight Commission partnered with Elon University poll, and we did two surveys, one a public opinion poll and the other a survey of Division I leaders, campus leaders, so presidents, athletics directors, a senior woman administrator, and faculty athletic representatives, kind of the four college sports legislated leadership positions. And we did these surveys after July 1 when the new House settlement rules came into effect. And, I would say from the key takeaways, the survey of Division I leaders revealed what the title of the report is, College Sports at a Crossroads. It really showed that campus leaders have deep concerns about the direction of Division I sports, very significant concerns about the financial stability, and then overwhelming support for federal legislation to help bring about some stability and clarity. So in terms of the components that we asked about, the majority of campus leaders did support some kind of federal legislation on NIL compensation, as well as legislation that would prohibit athletes from being classified as employees, and then legislation that would allow these national rules to supersede state laws, which we're still in a situation where there's a patchwork of state laws as it relates to NIL compensation, and the ability or inability of the NCAA or the new enforcement entity, the College Sports Commission, to actually enforce some of the rules that they had hoped to enforce. So that's the key takeaway from Division I leaders, which the Charlie Baker and his staff deserves, I think, a lot of credit because they've been able to really focus the message and educate internally the leaders about what they feel like is needed. From the public standpoint, the public's really mixed. I think there's so much that as you started this podcast, things are changing constantly, and I think the public's just really confused, and so they have mixed views about NIL compensation, about transfer rules. But it was really interesting, Chuck, that the public and Division I leaders, out of all the issues that were surveyed, all the changes, the impact of the House settlement, transfers, name, image, likeness rules. There were only two things that the public and leaders had in common. And number one was that the academic mission matters and that there should still be academic standards for college athletes. And then the second one was interesting. Both had, again, these were ones that had over 70% agreement between the public and Division I leaders. And that is that coaches should be required to earn a credential to show that they're trained for their roles. And so college coach credentialing has been, an initiative of the Knight Commission for over a decade that we try to work with coaches associations and kind of address that through different ways. But it's just really interesting that particular initiative rose up as one that was of high support of Division I leaders and the public.
It's and it struck me, Amy, and it was in multiple comments that Senator Cantwell made, and she kind of underlined it, right, as the underlying principles of the SAFE Act is just protecting students, right? Protecting students' rights.
Right.
Some of those may be more in terms of economic protections and
Right.
fairness.
Yeah.
But I had an opportunity for you to introduce to Billy Ebel, who's a former coach,
Mm-hmm.
who really speaks to that second point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is how do we, this is a different environment for coaching. I have a lot of empathy
Right.
for how to recruit.
Mm-hmm.
You hear coaches say all the time that I end up having to re-recruit my student athletes
Right.
every season. And
Yeah.
you know what a difference coaches have made in our journeys.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've always said, from in our support of this initiative, and we've again done some sponsorships with coaches associations, is that from the Knight Commission's perspective, we think the coaching profession is the most, it is a profession, first of all, and it is the kind of touch point and probably the most important factor in terms of whether an athlete has a positive or negative experience. And so, and coaches have, real appetite for, they're just like athletes. They want to be better, right? But as an industry, we haven't, there's not been a focus or requirement of, here's at least the basic standard of knowledge that you should have in order to be a college coach. And it's very different in other parts of the world where coaching licenses are viewed as more of a profession, and there's a very specific credential that you have to receive. But that's one that certainly is an area that has come up as well in some work that we sponsored around the question of employment. There are triggers and legal triggers for what is deemed to be employment, and are there ways in which institutions could mitigate that? If there's not federal legislation that prohibits them from being classified as employees. And if you look at the cases in the past where you had the men's basketball team at Dartmouth be deemed to be employees. Several of the factors there were related to control and the amount of control that coaches were exerting over the players that were over and above what was needed for their roles on the basketball team to show up for practice, those kinds of things. And so I bring that up because that's an example of the work that was done looked at control factors, and if you could train coaches on, here's the appropriate amount of control that you can have as a coach, right, versus the control that then puts it over the line and triggers a potential, employment type of situation. So that's where when you look at the kind of big picture and all these major risks happening, a coach credential may seem to be very trivial, but it really does tie into some of these bigger questions.
Oh, it certainly does. Amy, it takes me back when Twitter was fun, and I used to debate Jay Billis about professional and collegiate models, and that was a fairly simplistic argument, right? Is whether you're going to be student athletes or, right. And what swayed my perspective, right, is these student athletes' experiences, and unfortunately, I've run into several athletes who, were coached and treated much more like employees than they were students, right?
Right.
And so two issues that I know mean quite a bit to both of us that I found kind of most disturbing about the House settlement, although it was not as comprehensive. It was pretty specific, right, to the ruling itself. But gender equity, where the distributions were highly disproportionate, male to female. And then the second is something the Knight Commission has really lifted up, is protecting the Olympic sports.
Right.
Just current state to future state, are those values, as you mentioned, core values that are sustainable through this inflection?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and great point. I did want to, with the House settlement, there still seems to be quite a bit of misunderstanding on kind of the whether Title IX applies, right? Because the House settlement has really three different components. One is the back damages. Two is kind of the new rules that allow institutions to provide benefits and this NIL compensation to athletes directly. And then three is kind of the new framework for third party NIL. And the back damages did reward the majority of the rewards for back damages go to male athletes. I think it's 90% of the back damages are going to male athletes. And in that in the damages formula, the judge said, this is an antitrust case, not a Title IX case, because there were at the time Title IX questions or objections being raised about the back damages schedule, but they were antitrust cases, and so that was that's a different legal analysis and process for the back damages. And so where the mistakes being made going forward is that athletic directors, university presidents, just generally people are talking about, well, we're using the back damages formula for what we're doing moving forward. Well, that's, just incorrect to do that. So for going forward payments and how you're going to award institutional NIL compensation, the institutions need to be prepared to show how their awards are not discriminatory. And if they're able to do that, and they're still, it's not even, it may be fine if they're able to show that it wasn't, discriminatory, but they can't, they should not rely on, well, we just went by the back damages formula, because that's a totally different process. So that's where a basic, really important clarity point needs to be made on that point. And then I would say, and we surveyed on this question, and the survey results from campus leaders, the findings, there are concerns about what's going to happen moving forward, and there are legitimate concerns about support for women's sports and collegiate Olympic sports based on what athletic directors are saying is going to happen with funding. So, on those points, we've and particularly with collegiate Olympic sports, we've collaborated with the USOPC and other leaders to try to develop some new ideas to say, this is a new moment. So how can schools, conferences, leaders come together and maybe look at things differently, maybe look at competitions differently, organization of competitions. An example, and this came up in our survey, over 80% of Division I leaders said they would support more regional competitions for collegiate Olympic sports than some of the ways that competitions are set up now with the conference base. And as you know, some of those conferences are really spread out, obviously because of football and or basketball media markets.
Yeah, and there's some of the sports federations, and I'm grateful I've been able to be engaged with USTA and thinking about federations by sport that would offer some cost savings and perhaps expand some opportunities. Amy, one area unfortunately sometimes gets overlooked because we focus in higher ed. We think college athletics is the Power Four conferences, and there's a lot much deeper and broader. But the enrollment-driven models of opportunity and access, financial aid, partial scholarships,
Sure.
The headwinds around net tuition revenue, even institutional viability is being challenged. And I wonder, if you have any thoughts about some of the downward pressures of what Division I's going through on what this kind of means for everybody else.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And obviously from a women's sports, collegiate Olympic sports, one of the key values from the Knight Commission is opportunity, right? Just that we value the opportunity that college sports provides on a broad basis. And the NCAA has put out some projected data that we hope holds true, that they're predicting that we're not going to see a loss in opportunity. And some of that is certainly there have been some sports dropped, and leaders have cited, financial pressures of the House settlement. At the same time, some other Division I schools have added programs, and some of it, interestingly, is because of some of the roster limits that are going into effect in some sports. So they're adding other sports to make up for a loss of opportunity with those roster limits. So We're seeing some creative approaches by some institutions that could, across the board create more opportunity. I think, there are some Division II leaders who are concerned as well in terms of how is this ultimately going to impact Division II. But again, I think there also are some opportunities, and I think, as it any crisis, right, or a moment of disruption, there's going to be some opportunities. And you mentioned a big one that we talk about is college sports being more integrated in partnerships with the national governing bodies, and USTA in particular, tennis. We've This is again a minor point, but USTA gives grants to any institution, Division I, II, or III, if their facility is available for community use, because USTA's mission is to grow tennis across the board, right?
Right.
So that's an example. When we talk about that, we've had, some athletic directors just recently take advantage of that, even though it's been around for years. So I think I just use that as a tangible example that it shows where there is opportunity to do more with the national governing bodies for those sports.
Allowing student athletes to gain rankings, by virtue of college tournaments. The ITA has done a good job with that. Other
Mm-hmm.
elements of that brings it more. I get excited about conversations like John Alger's been a leader in about integrating more into the academic program, experiential learning that student athletes receive.
Yeah.
I think the Chronicle just ran a recent about the sports major, which is,
Mm-hmm.
so again, inflection points offer opportunities. What other green shoots do you see coming out of the ground of this level of change? Amy, I mean, you hear
Well,
and see what's
yeah,
happening.
you mentioned one. One is obviously what I just said with the national governing bodies. I mean, U.S. Soccer has put out a very bold proposal for men's soccer to consider. And the other one that you mentioned there that I think higher education leaders should really do some reading on if they're not familiar with it. But this kind of the educational value of sport itself. Um, and that is, looking at, for years we've always, as the academy's always accepted, dance major, music major, those kind of performance majors. What is it that's so different about sport that puts it in the extracurricular instead of co-curricular? And we know there are um, very specific learning outcomes from participation. So is there a way to be more intentional about what those learning outcomes are in a way that can be measured and can become, part of a curriculum? And so there are a lot of scholars. This is really faculty led initiative. Um, and so American University hosted a symposium with lots of different faculty from all over the country who are engaged in this kind of work. Boise State is hosting a symposium in March to continue this conversation. And if not a sport major, at least a minor or certificate programs that really do show the learning outcomes that athletes are gaining through their participation.
That was our tenet back when we chose Division II, was life in the balance, right? That it's the
Mm-hmm.
combination, the cumulative experience of college, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the outcome. Gerald
Mm-hmm.
Ford, hire veterans and former student athletes, was
Mm-hmm.
his leadership tendencies. All right, Amy, and again, I'm more appreciative of the consciousness, the integrity, kind of the moral compass that the Knight Commission. But I really had you on to say, what should it look like, right? With all these elements that are in the cauldron right now, um, I think the public and even college leaders would say, where is this going to end up, right? And I know
Mm-hmm.
if we had crystal balls, we could encompass all of this. But just from where we are today,
Hmm.
A couple bills in Congress,
Hmm.
lots of pressures like private equity,
Hmm.
um, new bundled rights agreements coming ahead, still some realignment, all of this. But what should it look like? What could it
Hmm.
look like if we took these elements and put them
Hmm.
together that worked best for athletes, leaders, and the outcomes we all hope for?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you two answers. One is, what can institutions and conferences do today in all of this that's an actionable, creates an outcome. And I'll hold up, there are six Division I conferences that that decided and changed some of their policies to be able to meet what we call our CARE model for college sports, connecting athletic revenues with the educational model of college sports. And it requires conferences to do things like having incentives around education, gender equity, and opportunity. And it requires the institutions to show financial responsibility in athletics in a variety of different ways. And so by operating their conferences and their institutions in alignment with those principles, they earn what we deem as care champion status. And, again, it, it follows the principles that haven't changed, but it just puts them into practice in very tangible ways. So I would say that's something that, particularly for the institutions outside of the Power Four, um, that's the way they can operate. And frankly, even at the highest levels, the you mentioned private equity. We based on everything we've seen, the data we've watched over the past 2 decades, it's a spending problem. It's not a revenue problem. The revenues have increased year after year after year, and so there are ways in which conferences can individually put in place some different spending thresholds or incentives, but college sports has just never gone there. Um, so there are things that can be done even without federal legislation that would enable college sports to operate in a much more principled fashion. So that's number one. Number two, if if I can make the structure, someone said, make the changes to the structure that you want to make. Definitely separate out big revenue football, have its own separate governing entity that's governed by an independent board in accordance with some principles, and it's not governed by, and nothing against the commissioners, because they're all very smart leaders, and they're doing what they're paid to do, which is to have their conference be the best, or their conference earn the most revenue. But I would just suggest that that outcome is not in the best interest of the health of college sports collectively. And so that's what needs to change from a structure standpoint, is to have more unified leadership around that sport of football that's guided by some principles of the health of the sport, what's in the best interest of the athletes for the long term. And then the NCAA can govern all the sports for which it operates a championship. And then we can create, for the Olympic sports, some more regional alignments that make more sense.
That's one very actionable and practical, especially about aligning back with those core principles. That's something you can do right now,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think that's a vision for what could be. Do you think the infrastructure, the core of the NCAA, absent, say, the struggle of managing the enterprise that college football's become? I'm certain there's a lot of principles that the Knight Commission has advanced that could improve, right? The governance of everything else. Does that
Right,
make sense?
right, absolutely. And part of the NCAA has gone through another governance restructuring, and in some ways it's a little better than the past, but still we think, athletes are still underrepresented. and there's no independent directors. So again, if you go back to what we put forward 5 years ago in 2020, it was principles around governance, first saying the structure has to change. Because you can't, if we were starting this all over again with a blank slate, you would never say, we're going to create this one structure here that's going to accept all the liabilities for all the sports. And we're going to allow this sport, football, to be separate and have its own separate championship, have its own separate revenue distribution with $1 billion of incentives. But the governance and liability is over here. Like as a CEO, you would never do that, right? So again, that's kind of what we continue to talk about is as the enterprise is looking for unprecedented federal legislation to remake college sports well into the future. Let's not remake it based on some inconsistent principles and inconsistent misaligned structures, right? Let's not exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, doing something that doesn't work again falls
Mm-hmm.
into a definition of a lot of other things like
Right.
foolishness and things like
Right.
that. Amy, so much of that public perception, as well as the leaders' perceptions that you've just tracked, I think this conversation would give leaders and anyone interested in where college sports is a pretty good, at least initial GPS about where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we'll continue, I know I will, to rely on the Knight Commission and especially the resources around the table. You have been constant in that. I mean, a thought partner, someone who's willing to listen to Division two and three and others and how it's viewed and certainly administered. The question I like to close with, because we had people help us and those people who made the difference. But when you're talking to young coaches or young administrators or people coming into the field, or perhaps it's a graduate class in sports management or sports communications, what do you tell them? What do you say in terms of casting themselves into the future with as much purpose as we found when we started?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I go back to what, Bill Friday, who I mentioned was a giant in higher education and accomplished so much. And he said to me, never stop learning. And he said, even where everything he accomplished and all that, he always really was thoughtful, asked good questions, was interested in different people's perspectives, and he saw, he was kind of living that out in terms of never stop learning. And so I think that's what I would say is the value of listening to others, trying to understand their point of views, and then just to also establish some principles and values, right, that you want to be guided by, so that what it is that's kind of the North Star, if you will, that something that's guiding you.
Yeah, well, again, I think what makes it all worthwhile is, those friendships. If we compared notes of all those people who we've learned from, and you would just some great people, right? Especially Amy, I have to give a shout out to our friends and colleagues who have come through the national office. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they have been committed educators, putting students first. A lot of times the NCAA gets rather beaten up at times,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But I always found, especially being campus based, that those were real collaborators and partners in the journey. And again, thanks for being one of those people that I've learned from along the way. So just to have this conversation and think with you future focused, I'm really appreciative.
No, thanks for having me, Chuck. It's always good to talk with you, and it's always come away thinking about more thoughtful issues, and clearly there's some big challenges ahead, but also big opportunities. And I agree with you about the leaders at the NCAA in the past and now. They're, trying to make this work ultimately for the athletes themselves and the opportunity, the reason this enterprise exists, right? To provide these incredible opportunities to young women and young men.
Always paying it forward. And if you are interested in what's next for intercollegiate athletics, share this conversation. Let us know what you think. We can always connect with resources with the Knight Commission. Most of those are always available online, and especially if you haven't watched one of the regular meetings and some of the YouTubes and others that you put out, Amy, I think uh, any other sources you'd want to commend to our listeners before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I would just, should have said this at the beginning. Knightcommission.org is our website, and that's where, a lot of different resources there, including the most recent meeting, as well as the survey that we were able to do in partnership with Elon University Poll. So if you go to knightcommission.org, you should be able to find all of it.
We'll make all of that available. So
Great.
again, thanks again, Amy, and we'll see
Yep.
what's next.
All right. Thank you.